Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Hello, on today's episode of Afternoon Light, I am joined by Dr Michael de Percy, who is a senior lecturer in political science at the University of Canberra. And among so many qualifications and affiliations, including with the Australian Army over the years and involved with logistics and telecommunications, he is a member of the Australian Nuclear Association. And today, Michael, we are going to speak about Menzies and the atomic age, which is a fascinating topic in light of contemporary debates, of course, about whether we adopt nuclear energy. I mean, it's contemporary debate, but it's a debate much older than both of us.
That's right. Thanks, Georgina. Great to be here. It's really fascinating, and I must say that I'm still in the early stages of my research into this particular area. But what impressed me was Menzies' involvement in a process that had actually been started before him. And it's quite interesting, in the revisionist history we've become used to, that point hasn't really been picked up. And what I'm really keen on is a rethinking of Menzies in the atomic era, because I think it's something that's been lost over time.
How did, as I guess a foundational question, how did Australia start off its relationship with nuclear science? Because we were pretty important in all of this, weren't we?
Well, that's right. We weren't as important as the Americans, but there was involvement in the Manhattan Project, and a lot of this was done through Britain. But of course, we had our alliance with the United States, and it's an interesting turning point in Australian history, as we know, because of that reliance on the United States. And simply the Battle of Coral and the Battle of Midway saved us effectively, and our alliances started changing. But at the same time, we still had the involvement in the Commonwealth. And look, I think probably the main thing to understand is that the United States, after the end of the Second World War, became very jealous and protective of their technology. And they weren't willing to share that even with the UK. And so Australia was kind of on the outer. And it's really interesting too, Australian author Neville Shute, in his book On the Beach, which was written in 1957, which happens to be the time of the first nuclear reactor in Australia. So it's really sort of fascinating that the book actually represents the strategic idea of a nuclear war at the time, that it would happen in the Northern Hemisphere, and Australia really wouldn't be involved. In many ways, both the UK and the US looked to Australia as a place for resources and potential skills and other things that could contribute to their defence, as opposed to it being about Australia. So at the same time, Australia was having this idea that we might be left alone again in Southeast Asia. So we would have to integrate and work with, probably more as a middle power. But at the same time, how could we do that in this atomic age where we had nuclear weapons? And so Australia's contribution was very important, but mostly to the UK. And the UK effectively saw Australia as a source of expertise and technicians and so on. But at the same time, Australia wanted access to nuclear technology. And so it had to participate with either the US or the UK to get that. To put it in perspective, I'm really interested in how pragmatism will often overcome political ideologies in the way that policy choices are made. And if we go back to 1946, the British held a conference that the Australians attended, and it was kind of badged as an informal conference in the UK. But it was effectively to outline how they could develop their own nuclear weapons and nuclear technology, independent of the Americans, because of that jealously guarded secret. And so Australia went to this conference with the intention of obtaining nuclear weapons so that we could defend ourselves in the absence of the UK and the US in this Northern Hemisphere war.
It's very hard to imagine that in this day and age because, I mean, obviously Australia is a signatory to the NPT treaty, so we've renounced any rights to nuclear weapons. We accept that there are only 5 official nuclear powers. Obviously there are some nuclear countries that are not signatories to the NPT and fall outside that. But there was a different time when atomic energy and nuclear weapons were first being developed, obviously in the Second World War, but just after, we were pretty open to it, weren't we?
Absolutely.
And the public was open to the idea too, or was it very much under wraps?
This is an interesting area that I want to look into in more detail in the archives, and I'm not there yet, but there seems to be a link between anti-nuclear and the Communist Party in Australia. Right. I'm not sure where that goes or how Menzies' thinking fits into that. Yes. And obviously that would be a completely different story to tell. I mean, obviously people were concerned about what was possible now, and that was the general feeling throughout the world. But at the same time, there was also, well, who will survive if this does escalate? And so nuclear was seen as a deterrent. If you had that capability, then nobody would bother attacking you because of mutual assured destruction, which wasn't really coined until much later. But the general thinking was that if you had that capability. So Australia was looking at, if it couldn't get strategic capability, it would get like tactical nuclear weapons that it could potentially use in Malaya, which was a source of concern in the 40s through to the 60s. So Australia was sort of focused on getting whatever it could out of this arrangement, and very conscious that both the UK and the US were not really thinking about Australia in that particular regard in terms of their own defence.
No. Robert Menzies becomes Prime Minister in 1949, so very much this era. His predecessor was Ben Chifley, and of course John Curtin, Ben Chifley's predecessor, dies just before the end of the Second World War. What was Menzies' personal attitude towards nuclear power?
It's interesting that it brought out much of his personality. And the most interesting thing for me is when he opened the Lucas Heights Reactor. Basically, there's two buttons, the black button to start it, and he presses the black button to start it. And then he says afterwards, and I've got the words here, I feel like a naughty boy. I feel like pushing the button. And this other button, the red button, of course, is called the scram button. And they asked him afterwards about this button. He said, basically, it means what it says. Like, if you press this button, then scram. So it was kind of interesting that he had that approach. At the same time, he was really keen on Australia's ability to defend itself. Hence, this desire to acquire nuclear weapons was part of the package. But also, he had this idea that nuclear energy, and of course, when he was elected, we hadn't discovered our uranium reserves at that point in time. And so once this happens, then it becomes more obvious that we have this capability now, a much bigger player in the global atomic age. So
when were the uranium reserves discovered? They must have just been shortly after he was elected, because I know the first large uranium mine was opened at Rum Jungle in 1954. So it must have been
54, I think it was. Even the name Rum Jungle.
It's a great name.
It comes from a hammock, but in the Australian context, it was actually based on a thief in the area who used rum to get some miners drunk and then stole all their gold. And so Rum Jungle became that. And Menzies sort of loved that name. He thought it was very funny. So another sort of humorous side of him. I understand there was a competition to find uranium in Australia. And if my memory serves me correctly, it's 1950 that it's found. So it's kind of happens in Menzies' first term. And then you're right, then we actually have that mine that Rum Jungle opens up. And that, of course, brings in the British as well. And so it makes Australia much more important than it was back in 1946 during the Chifley era. So that's what I'm saying about, this is not all about Menzies. This happens under Curtin and then Chifley and then Menzies, and it keeps going. So it was never just this one person who did all these things, whereas that revisionist history would sort of point to Menzies as the bad guy in many ways, especially when we look at ideas of nuclear colonialism and things like that, which I think is the reason I want to rethink this whole process, because it's a very oversimplified view of that history.
So he's generally supportive of nuclear energy in Australia, but it's interesting that nuclear energy doesn't really progress that much during his 16 years in office from 49 to 66. Why do you think that is? Is it clear?
My understanding was he wanted Australia to develop the skills, and this is when I talk about Menzies' legacy. And again, if you look at the establishment of the Australian National University, so the bill goes through in 1946, so again, in the Chifley era, but there's this idea even then that the ANU will contribute in a large way to the atomic age, in that it will develop the scientists and necessary skills. And I'm sorry, it's really difficult not to go all over the place here, because you've got all of these things happening all at once. We've got the move toward the Snowy Hydro scheme.
Yes.
And the Snowy Hydro scheme, which it links to the recent cabinet appointments by Scott Morrison, the use of cabinet powers when it comes to defence or national security. The Snowy Hydro scheme is kicked off on that basis, and they actually see the first feeder reactor being established at Snowy Hydro. So Snowy Hydro was not just about energy, it was also about nuclear energy and the like. But Menzies had this idea that it wouldn't be feasible financially until about the 1980s in Australia. So he had that sort of a vision of when it would occur. And of course we have all sorts of issues that happen in the meantime that sort of intervene. But in many ways, his main reason was it was more about building the capability so that when it was feasible in the Australian context. And the other context, of course, is we had coal reserves and gas reserves, which were actually cheap and easy to use. And so why would you bother switching at great expense? So he sort of thought, well, we can wait until we can catch up on the technology later, as long as we have these skills and institutions established now. And so that, I think in many ways, that was his thinking. And that's part of that legacy. But like I said, that legacy is not just his, it's also from the Chifley era as well, and that whole sort of setup. And in many ways, I think it's a case of prime ministers doing what they have to do, and that's put the nation first. In many ways, that's the thinking that you can see as the thread through at least into the 1960s around nuclear energy and nuclear weapons.
So in terms of the nuclear weapons angle, I mean, Menzies is quite keen, as you say, for Australia to have nuclear weapons, potentially strategic ones or at least tactical ones, for deterrence or to take action in its near north. But then we are participating in nuclear non-proliferation treaty negotiations. Menzies is not exactly wholeheartedly in support of those negotiations, is he? He's somewhat opposed because obviously he sees that as then shutting Australia out of what could be an incredibly important deterrence to security concerns to our north.
Absolutely. And I think, though, because he was such a great politician and obviously our longest serving, he could really read the room, to use the current term. My sort of general idea was he was sort of hopeful that this would happen. And it did happen in stages too. So it wasn't like we sort of woke up one day and said, oh, we're not going to participate in this anymore. But it was public opinion around a whole bunch of things. And this really starts to happen in the 1980s. And of course, we end up with the other problem then of the Hawke government opening up uranium mines while at the same time pushing the non-proliferation barrow, so to speak. So there's always been this sort of toing and froing in Australia around that.
Yeah.
A lot of it to do with public opinion, a lot of it to do with if we don't have these weapons, then we're not a threat, then why would anyone bother attacking us? But I really struggle with what in military terms I would sort of say is the left and the right of arc. And the left of arc is that sort of what the Yale professor Harold Bloom, he spoke about the school of resentment, which basically went back through history and resented everything that didn't fit with their current sense of morality.
Right.
So that really bothers me because, I mean, others are going to look back on us right now and have the same view. So I think it's hubris to think that you can do that. But then the right of arc is Neville Chamberlain and the sense of appeasement, which didn't work either. So how do you sort of not resent your nation state and its security and those sorts of things? And at the same time, how do you not pursue peace that actually creates war, if that makes sense? So it's really, I guess it's the question of the age is how do we avoid the current situation? And really, I think appeasement is not going to work, and neither is going back and trashing our history. So we have to sort of think about where does this fit in the context of the times. In those times, I think that was very important. And like I said to you, this wasn't just Menzies, this was Chifley as well, who had this idea that nuclear weapons were important for Australia at that point in history.
We didn't go ahead with nuclear energy. As you say, we had alternative sources of energy pretty cheaply and plentifully available, even though uranium was, of course, incredibly available with the largest reserves of uranium of any country. I think we have 31% of the world's uranium reserves, which is quite a lot. But we did set up our own nuclear reactor at Lucas Heights in New South Wales. Can you tell me how that came to pass?
My understanding is that the agreement for British nuclear tests in Australia required them to help us build the reactor. And the reactor was meant to initially be for research, for medical purposes, but also for nuclear energy purposes. And this carried on into, I understand, into the 70s, where that idea of nuclear energy became dismantled and it essentially became focused right up to the present with the new Opal reactor. It was used for medicine and research purposes, and that was it. So, I mean, Menzies had the idea that Australian scientists would work and collaborate with international scientists here and overseas, but also give us the ability to bring specialists from overseas to work here as well for that transfer of knowledge. And it's really interesting, your earlier podcast with David First Roberts talks about the Colombo Plan, and that is in all this same era, that whole sort of idea of sharing and the engagement or thinking about Southeast Asia. So all of these things are sort of happening simultaneously. And as I said, the Australian National University is being established, Snowy Hydro is being established. And
you have Commonwealth scholarships to
absolutely.
get more Australian young people into universities, to increase science training, as you say. There's sort of a sense that we need to be ready and equipped to deal with all these tricky scientific challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it was in 1958 when one of the buildings, what was the Australian Atomic Energy Commission, which is now the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation. So Menzies is opening a building and gives a speech there. And he effectively says the reason we created this was not to say, look what we can do, or, why should we bother? We could just get this from overseas. But it was more about developing our own capability and our own capacity and skills. And so I think the whole sort of idea behind the reactor, and this is the trouble when you look at that revisionist idea of British tests here. I mean, these were very serious defence initiatives for everyone involved. And I'm not suggesting we should say that that's great, let's do it again. Obviously, there are all sorts of issues. But at the same time, we wouldn't have that medical capability that we do right now that saves lives on a daily basis without having had that initial reactor set up in 1957. And so with the new Opal reactor now, which is much more efficient, safer, all the rest of it, that capability is a legacy of that particular era. So without that legacy, where would we be in terms of medicine? So it's really difficult to sort of say what's good or bad, other than if we look to how we got here and what we're capable of doing now, particularly in the medical side of things. We're quite advanced globally in that field.
Michael, it's interesting you keep referring to Chifley and Curtin, that Menzies wasn't the first Prime Minister to embrace the atomic age, and in fact a lot of the activities around nuclear energy and weapons and testing, they started prior to Menzies becoming Prime Minister in 1949. But eventually the Labor Party as a political party and as its sort of policy platform becomes very opposed to nuclear, and it features in their party platform, and it's sort of an article of faith for a generation of Labor Party activists and politicians. We oppose nuclear energy, but also obviously weapons. Gareth Evans, for example, a Labor foreign minister in the Hawke years, I mean, he makes quite a significant part of his career devoted to the banning of nuclear weapons and nuclear non-proliferation. That's a real passion of his. But when does this change happen in Labor, that the left of the political spectrum in Australia becomes so distasteful of all things nuclear?
And a side of the research that I'm doing at the moment will be to look at those early origins of the anti-nuclear movement in Australia. It really starts to happen in the 60s, in the peace movement. It really starts to happen in Australia in the 70s with the sort of removing the nuclear energy side of the Lucas Heights Reactor. But by the 1980s, it becomes part of that Labor platform. But the interesting thing to this day, there are people on all sides of politics. It's a bit like the monarchy, that there are Labor monarchists and there are Liberal Republicans, and it's very much the same with nuclear energy. There are some who are opposed to it because of the non-proliferation. And I've said this previously, that every tradie I talk to thinks it's a no-brainer that we should have nuclear energy, but every bureaucrat I speak to in Canberra thinks that it will only create or cause us to get into the nuclear energy and then into nuclear weapons and so on. So it's kind of like this strange balance between the practicality of it and the sort of moral imperative behind it.
But not every country with nuclear power has nuclear weapons. In fact, it's completely the opposite. Only a very, very small number of nuclear-powered countries have nuclear weapons. So
no, that's right.
They don't go together necessarily.
Absolutely. Politics is not always rational. Neither are elections. So,
no.
But it's that message. It's really difficult to overturn. And people will immediately talk about the 3 Mile Island, which Midnight Oil sang about, of course, and then Chernobyl, and then Japan just recently. But even the Japanese are now actually turning back on their nuclear reactors because they've found that the risk to their lives and livelihood is actually more from not having a reliable source of energy than it is to deal with the issues of nuclear reactors. And again, too, if you look at the number of nuclear reactors throughout the world, it's more dangerous to drive your car than to live near a nuclear reactor on percentages. Now, obviously, that's not going to work for everyone. There's been lots of research that sort of indicates that a lot of this is a kind of an irrational fear that then manifests in policy. And how you overcome that is going to be difficult. But I dare say that as energy prices continue to soar, people are going to start looking for other solutions. And that's what's certainly happening in Japan. It's happened in Korea. France has done the same, and Germany, of course, is really suffering from not doing that, from not going back to nuclear. So
So, Michael, you may not realise I lived in Japan in 2011 when the Fukushima nuclear reactor started to melt down because of the tsunami that had hit it after the enormous quake off the eastern coast of Japan. And that sense of terrible fear, of course, of something that was completely out of the control of humans, and even the cleverest scientists, the best engineers, the will of the US military might not have stopped the worst case scenario from happening. I mean, having lived through that, I can feel that fear that people had, and that this was entirely of man's creation. I mean, the natural disaster wasn't, but this nuclear power plant had been created and it needed certain conditions for it to be stable. But if those conditions were not met, then it would be out of man's control and could have catastrophic consequences. And not just in the immediate period, but for thousands of years. That's the other thing I think that people worry about, that if the land's contaminated or the water's contaminated, you might not ever be able to remediate it. And in fact, there's a whole area around Fukushima that is just abandoned because it is just so polluted with the radioactive elements. I mean, I'm not scaremongering, but having experienced that, I can see why there are a lot of concerns. And in Japan, the nuclear industry, up until Fukushima, they very much pushed the nuclear safety myth. It's 100% safe, don't worry about it, nothing to see here, guys. They paid off depressed rural communities in order to convince them to accept a nuclear power plant in their community. And there were, of course, benefits to the community. But of course, when the worst case did happen, and it didn't totally at Fukushima, it was pretty bad, but at least it didn't completely melt down and blow. You're left with villages that will never ever be inhabited again. So it's a wicked problem, like all these big decisions, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it's interesting too that in one of his speeches, Menzies said words to the effect of, it's probably a good thing that politicians don't know everything about this. I'll leave that to the scientists.
Oh, right. But there were politicians in Australia, not just federal politicians, but state politicians who were very passionate about having nuclear energy in their patch. I know South Australian Premier Thomas Playford in 1952, he was advocating for a nuclear power station in the Spencer Gulf, and I think he even announced that there would be one between Whyalla and Port Augusta. There was a site established, but it was never constructed, of course. And then Charles Court in Western Australia in the 70s, he announced plans for a nuclear power reactor near Perth. So there were these premiers who were very aspirational about having nuclear power in their state, less so these days. Well, so it's been banned, so a bit more difficult.
Yeah, look, it was interesting. Bob Carr was being interviewed by Jo Lackenby, who's the president of the Australian Nuclear Association. And she was sort of suggesting to him that his fears were based on earlier sort of standards that could then be ameliorated in the present. And he was very reluctant to side with nuclear energy, but he also was open to being convinced otherwise. And I think that's part of the issue, is that even if Australia doesn't end up with nuclear energy, at the moment it's being taken away from the equation. And I think this is problematic because, look, at the moment we're looking at 82% renewables by 2030. We're not even close, and it's not going to happen. So it's basically impossible, but we're not talking about something that actually is technologically possible. And I think too, Japan and earthquakes is sort of synonymous, whereas Australia is much more stable geologically, and we certainly have areas that are much more stable. The other thing too is that if we look, for example, I was in Seoul recently, and interesting that Menzies, of course, coincides with the Korean War, which feeds into this whole sort of situation. But what was really interesting was when we went up to the DMZ, a couple of friends of mine who were retired colonels from the Korean and US military, and they took us around the DMZ, and we were driving through this valley, and there are all these holiday homes, and I'm sort of thinking, what's the attraction here? Is it skiing? Like, why would you come here? And the reason was because the air's clean. Because Seoul is there's so much smog that your holiday is to go to a place where you can actually breathe. And I've experienced this in Shanghai, Beijing and Seoul as well, where there's so much smog that after a couple of weeks you're coughing like a local, and it's really disturbing. And I think the big problem is that if we have something that kills us slowly, like fossil fuel emissions and smog, we don't attribute the cause. Whereas if we have a particular isolated event, we attribute the cause directly. And yet, where's the trade-off? Like, which is the better way to be damaged, I guess? It's a really difficult problem. As you say, it's a wicked problem because One, maybe you can have a holiday away from it, but it really struck me that that was the nature of a holiday for many people living in Seoul, was to go into the mountains in the fresh air. Well, you can't even imagine that in Australia. So you can imagine that for the Koreans, nuclear energy takes away a lot of that problem for them.
So it wasn't until 1998, I hope I've got my facts right here, that Australia formally banned nuclear energy. It was prohibited under law. And the Prime Minister at the time, John Howard, he was able to get some political trade-off in Parliament so he could do the new Opal reactor at Lucas Heights, which, as you say, is incredibly important for medical research and medical treatments and radiotherapy and the like. So that was built to replace the original Lucas Heights reactor that had been built in 1958, so it was pretty old. It needed replacing after 40 years. So we formally banned nuclear energy. And I mean, I remember the late 90s, there was a review into nuclear energy. I think Ziggy Zwitkowski undertook that. It's a perennial debate. It seems to come up every 10 years. Again, Peter Dutton, the opposition leader, he's talking about the possibility of small modular reactors, although I understand the queue of orders for small modular nuclear reactors is as long as, well, many arms. So I think Australia is way at the back of the queue if we ever do put in an order. I mean, the fact that we have formally banned it, politically, how difficult is it to overturn that? And is the Australian public even got an appetite for it?
That's the interesting thing. There's been a lot of studies, and I dare say that the people in favour of nuclear energy will increase as power bills increase, and we're starting to sort of see that move already. If we go back to 1998, the trade-off was important because we needed a nuclear reactor, and I urge anyone who gets the opportunity to go to Lucas Heights and visit the Opal reactor.
You can visit it?
Yeah, it's fantastic. Right. It's fantastic. I mean, obviously you don't go into the reactor part, but you get a sort of sense of the history, and they tell you about what they had to do in the old reactor compared to what they do now, and how much more efficient it is and much more productive in terms of the medical sort of products and so forth. But I guess the thing is that in 1998, we weren't really thinking about climate to the degree that we are now. It wasn't a political issue in the way that it is now. The environment, sure, was an issue, but it wasn't about air quality and things like that. So I think given those times, that was probably a smart decision, because if we didn't have that reactor, we'd have people who wouldn't be getting medical care, life-saving medical care that they can otherwise get. So in the context of 1998, that was a pretty smart trade-off. And again, John Howard was very much the pragmatist. It was more about what's the outcome that we're seeking, and he would often go against the party platform in order to achieve a particular outcome. And I think that's another example of him being very pragmatic. So I think the good thing is it's not enshrined in the Constitution, so it can be overturned through legislation, it can be revised. And I think the main thing is we need that appetite for that to occur. The small modular reactors, a lot of the changes to do with the construction, because the amount of concrete that's necessary for a traditional reactor is enormous, and it has to be perfect. And whereas now they have these, it's almost like prefabricated cement bricks that are held together with this metal sort of brace. It's really sort of fascinating, yet deceptively simple process. So, and the idea of the SMRs, they can be co-located. So you can start with one and then put another next to it and keep adding on. And the Canadians are doing this in a very big way. And again, what's interesting is that the Canadians were involved with the US because they had uranium during the 40s. So they were very much partnered with the United States. And of course, the proximity helped. Canada has never really had that issue around nuclear energy. There was some thinking that they would decommission them, and then it was sort of revamped with the new small modular reactors. So I think Canada's a really good example, I think, of a country that has similar issues around either side of politics, but is getting on with the job and is using nuclear energy as one of their mainstays, I guess.
What I find interesting about Canada is that when the British in the 50s were wanting to conduct nuclear tests, they looked at Canada as well as Australia, and the Canadian government, I understand at the time, decided that the risk to the Arctic environment was too great and that they would not want the nuclear test conducted on their territory. Australia did agree, and there was, of course, thinking around, well, if we agree, then we might get a piece of the nuclear weapons pie, and that will be beneficial for our strategic posture and environment. And so we went ahead with it. But that obviously then has the overlay of the legacy of this sort of nuclear colonialism and how that fed into the anti-nuclear debates in Australia, potentially not in Canada because they never were host of nuclear tests, and of course the tragedy that happened to Indigenous people in those areas who were really, really badly affected. We have that experience in Australia, the Canadians don't.
For sure. I guess the difference is that Canada had access to the technology through its involvement with the United States and the fact that it had uranium to provide. So very different circumstances. And obviously the things that happened at Maralinga were terrible. But again, I come back to the point that it wasn't just Sir Robert who went and brought this here. This was agreed to in 1946 during the Chifley era. And again, if we didn't have that access to that technology today, then people's lives would be at stake, whereas it's a huge trade-off in the past. But for me, it's more about rethinking that and understanding those legacies as opposed to pointing at one figure in history and blaming them for a particular circumstance. But I dare say that Canada's reaction was it was clearly in the picture with the US, and in many ways it was closer than the UK in that whole sort of process, whereas Australia was very much on the outer. And again, if you put it in the context of the times, we'd just been through a war where our homeland was being attacked. There was a real threat of invasion. So you can imagine people of that era would be thinking about what happened just 5 years before, and they'd be really concerned about that not happening again. And again, to go back to Korea to me is the frontier of democracy, and they're very passionate about democracy. And the thing that really struck me was that for the Koreans, they will never lose Seoul again. And this is something that happened 70 years ago, not just 5 years ago. So that's sort of the living memory of that horror for them is what drives them in their sort of national defence and their capability now. The really interesting thing is that Menzies committed Australian troops to that, which has enabled us to maintain our relationship with the United States, which obviously has been extremely beneficial over the years. So again, I guess there's lots of legacies, lots of issues, and there's always these horrible moments in history that we should learn from, for sure. But at the same time, I think if we hadn't been through some of those experiences, we wouldn't have some of the technologies that we have today and those potentialities from nuclear. And again, look, if we get to the end of our policy debate and we decide it's never going to happen and it doesn't, then at least it's part of that democratic process. Whereas I think the legacy of the 1998 decision to prohibit nuclear energy has been problematic in that debate. But coming back to Canada, Australia actually has a treaty with Canada where we can actually adopt their technology. They will transfer their technology to us to enable nuclear energy as well. And I only know this through my involvement with the Australian Nuclear Association, having attended some of the sessions there. But again, it's very sort of interesting that we have the ability and the capability. But I guess...
But we've banned it.
But we've banned it. And
so we banned it after we signed that treaty, obviously.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah. Yes, that's right. Yes, that's right. And again, it was a political trade-off, and politics is all about trade-offs, of course. The interesting thing for me, though, is that what I find problematic is that we don't have that same spirit of discovery that was evident at the end of the Second World War. And I think our universities are sort of shying away from some of these really important industrial applications. And that really sort of bothers me, I think.
And why do you think that is, Michael?
Well, I think part of it is privilege. We're very privileged. We're struggling at the moment, but it's not quite the struggle that you can see in any developing country. And I think in many ways, many of our young people have never been through a recession. So, I don't know there'd be too many people these days who live on pikelets to get through university or their work and other things like many of us had to do back in the day. So I think in many ways that we're very privileged. So we're focused on really sort of high-end ideas and ideals as opposed to those sort of practical applications. And I think what worries me is if our economy doesn't continue to boom in the way that it has and provide that level of privilege, then we're going to have to sort of dig deep once again. And I think in many ways our universities need to be leading that industrial sort of revolution as opposed to the social revolutions. We're basically outsourcing our capabilities elsewhere while we're focused on these other issues. They're important, but I don't think they should be given the priority that they're certainly being given at the moment.
The game changer, though, surely is the AUKUS agreement with the United States. And when you were talking about the legacy of the Korean War, it did remind me that, of course, the ANZUS alliance with the United States is a legacy of the Korean War. And Percy Spender, the External Affairs Minister at the time in 1950, suggested to Menzies that if Australia did commit some troops to the Korean War effort, that may be an incentive for the United States to sign the ANZUS alliance. And of course, Australia then signed the soft peace treaty with Japan too, which the United States had wanted Australia to do, and the deal was done. But once again, we've got an agreement that is a technology sharing agreement in AUKUS, but of course the key feature of that is the acquisition of nuclear submarines from US or UK technology. And again, we are left with this capability gap because we don't have nuclear submarines. We have the Opal reactor, of course, but don't really have a nuclear industry. So who are these scientists who are probably in nappies at the moment? How are they going to get the training and have the capability to work on these nuclear submarines or the associated industries that will feed into it? Do we have a plan to train them, to bring in experts, to create that ecosystem? And do we need to revisit nuclear energy, not just for our energy security needs, but also for the purposes of supporting this whole sector if we are to be serious about the deterrent effect of these nuclear submarines?
Absolutely. And if we look at the submarine commanders, not only do you have to be a sailor, but you also, or a submariner, but you also have to have a PhD in nuclear physics. So not just scientists, but scientists who are also capable of fighting a war. I mean, these skills are just incredibly well above what we've ever seen here.
Yeah.
And it bothers me that we weren't thinking about that before. It's like we just dropped the ball and all of a sudden we've woken up and found ourselves in another century and we're sort of scrambling. And I don't even think we're scrambling enough. But again, this is where that sort of Menzies era was all about developing those capabilities with a thought about a future situation, whereas we sort of seem to have been asleep at the wheel for quite some time. I think it's great that we have this. And again, we couldn't have this unless we had ANZUS. And I think too, it really struck me when we were in Korea, we went up to Kapyong. I wanted to visit where the Battle of Kapyong Memorial is and see the terrain. And it was really interesting. The Australians used...
And I mean, we should just say that is one of the most incredible battles that Australian troops have been in, and I know some people say it's even more important and more amazing than Gallipoli. I think the Australian troops are outnumbered by the Chinese troops, it's sort of 1 to 10, and they prevailed. So.
Absolutely. Well, look, they were well supported by close air support and artillery. There was a troop of US tanks. The Canadians were on the other hill. But yeah, look, Australia definitely played its part. But when we went there, there's a Commonwealth Memorial, and I was with my two mates and my partner's going to take the photo for us. And as she goes to take the photo, this woman on the other side of the street yells out, "I'll take the photo." And she puts her bags of groceries down, runs across the street, gets us all together and takes the photo, then bows and says, "Thank you for your service," and then goes back. I was like, I couldn't believe it. And I went to an Asia Society event where a Korean general came up to me and said, "I'd just like to say thank you for the 340 Australians who gave their lives." And he pointed out the window and said, "So we could create this." And it's an incredible city. And it just struck me that we don't even remember this. How many Australians know how many Australians died in Korea? And it really sort of struck me that the importance of our involvement in these things. And it's tragic that people lost their lives, and it's really tragic for the families and so on. But if they hadn't have given that sacrifice, we wouldn't be where we are now. We wouldn't have these privileges and so forth. But it really sort of strikes you when you go to somewhere like Korea where they're technically still at war. But the people...
It's a truce, not a peace.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But the respect they have for Australians was just, it really blew me away. I was really interested too. My grandfather was in the British Commonwealth Occupation Force at Hiroshima, and his battalion, the 67th Battalion, actually became the 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment. But he came back in 1949 and didn't go on to Korea because it wasn't a thing when his service was up. But he probably would have been at Kapyong if he'd stayed in. So really sort of a very interesting history. But again, it all comes back to these legacies of Sir Robert. That's the part that fascinates me.
Yes. Well, on that note, Michael, I'd like to thank you for this discussion on Menzies and the atomic age. It's absolutely fascinating, very important, not just so that we understand our history, but for current debates, because we've had these debates before and we are the recipients of the legacy of the decisions that were made in decades past, and we need to deal with that for better or worse. And well, let's hope that the wisdom of our leaders and representatives and the bureaucrats involved too prevails over whatever decisions are made in the future about nuclear energy. So thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.